Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October 3rd edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting with MakerDAO. I'm Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at Maker. I usually start this off, and it's almost an autonomic response right now. I say that we have a lot of really interesting things to go over today and a lot of really important issues to deal with. Today, that's not true. I'm not entirely sure whether we do have a lot of really good issues to go over because everybody is, not everybody, a lot of people are on the move today or this week heading to DevCon. MakerDAO is no exception. Lots of people from the org are in flight right now, which is why why Cyrus will not be joining us today. So I was racking my brains earlier about what it is we're going to talk about today. And I want to talk about coming up with things to talk about. I'm getting meta on this one. So here's the issue. We have this venue where we get together every week. We talk about stuff. It's the highlight of my week. We have some really great thought leaders. I can't believe I said that in this call. We also have a lot of really great guests. We talk about some interesting issues and we delve into the emerging process that's happening in governance. But one of the things that I've been struggling with is trying to figure out ways to make the conversation in these calls slightly more organic than they have been. And I know that it can be, we're doing a lot of pushing of information. Frequently we will present something or somebody in the call will present something and then we'll immediately stop and say, okay, everybody ask your questions now. And generally the questions are not forthcoming. And so I know that there's ways to incentivize or to encourage people to engage more in open calls like this, because I've read articles about them in the past, but I'm drawing a blank on what the tips and tricks were. And so I actually want to turn this back to the people on the call today. I want to see if this group has ideas about how we can increase some of the back and forth or some of the engagement that we see in this call, whether there's some format changes that people have been thinking about or be interested in seeing, if things are working or not working. I would dearly love to hear about it. Particularly anything that would encourage more interaction from the same people that we hear from call after call. It's going to be a kind of a chicken and egg problem because I've just talked about how it's hard to get people to engage, and I'm asking them to engage immediately to solve the problem of the engagement issue that we have. So we could leave it there and let that sit for a few minutes. If anybody has any suggestions, please type them in the chat on the side, and or just jump in right now and start filling us in on some of the things we can alter.
I'm happy to jump in for a sec. On the calls that I've been on, I haven't seen much of a sort of like a point counterpoint type discussion. We've outlined that there are clearly counterpoints that are out there to particular initiatives, and it might be interesting if in future calls, if we selected one and sort of encouraged, like, even if it was like reverse thinking, like sort of like trying to defend the other position to a certain extent, to try to see if there's any validity at all to certain arguments that we might find really like illogical. So something like that, where we sort of examine issues a little more deeply from the other point of view, might be interesting.
That's interesting. That's a good point. So I guess what you're saying is that people might be less inclined to take a contrarian position in whatever approximation of real life we have right now. So people are less likely to pipe up to disagree. Is that it? And then,
yeah, from what I've witnessed here, it seems like it's usually a pretty one-directional conversation, and we've identified that there are other points of view out there, and it might be a good use of time to examine them a little more closely and just sort of take a different look. Yeah, it's like looking at the governance process from different perspectives might be useful.
So setting up something
I like that idea.
Debates.
Yeah, like I was hesitant to call it a debate, but like, it could be more like just like, I guess it could be, we could do it like a debate, or just like a point counterpoint, like sort of like presenting arguments from different sides. If we just had a topic, like for instance, like the big one, like multi-collateral die, having dedicated time to sort of presenting, okay, here's here's a different take on it. Here's a different way people might be looking at it. I haven't seen much of that here, so it might be good use of time. I'm not sure where else it's being done except for in the forums and occasionally in the chat, and of course on Reddit and Twitter.
So what would the mechanics look like? Would somebody like you step up and offer to take the contrarian position, and then we have like a mock UN kind of deal, or would we try and find the people that are taking outlier positions or whatever, the opposite position of an issue?
Let's get Preston Bryan on this call.
Now you're asking me to do work. Like,
I can find out.
Yeah. You just wanted ideas, man.
Yeah,
I know.
No, I'm kidding. No, I think you're right. I think
we've identified why people don't speak up is because they're going to get pinged, tagged in.
I mean, if we were to go down that road, we'd probably want to just figure out like what's our goal, and sort of maybe an initial thought on that is really just to get a better understanding of the other points of view. Because I think that as MakerDAO grows, as DAI gets more adopted, there's going to be more and more points of view that we that are deeper in the governance process don't understand. So it might be good to take time to examine them to get a better understanding, so that ultimately a goal for me would be to have more information to go out and educate people about what we're doing here. And maybe it would involve inviting people who are outspoken on issues, who maybe have some, maybe there's some influencers out there who are swaying opinion in a way that we think is sort of opposite of what we're thinking here. And it might be interesting to sort of dive into those a little more deeply on this call.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that we have been sheltered in these calls, and that's sheltered or lucky, I suppose. It depends on your opinion, that we are amazingly aligned from my perspective in these calls. There isn't a ton of contention. It's just a matter of figuring out which parts of all this enormous amount of work that we have ahead of us are we going to do first, and then what that looks like. Getting somebody,
Can I just jump in here?
Sure. Please.
So, interestingly, part of the alignment should be the fact that we're all trying to stick to scientific governance, right? Because in theory, if everyone's going by scientific governance, everyone should be looking at the evidence. And in theory, if you've got evidence, you should only be saying one thing, right? Like, it should be describing reality. So it's like, there should only really be one view based on the evidence.
Well, there is influence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very difficult to do, because you can have a single piece of evidence but interpret it in multiple different ways.
That is true.
Yeah, and on top of that, for like complex stuff, like for example, the whole setting the initial DSR values and figuring out where DSR is paid out of, that's not really just like a cut and dry, disagreement or agreement type conversation. It's more an exploratory conversation, and you're trying to wrap your head around all of the sort of moving pieces of that and trying to make a good decision based on the context, right? So a lot of it is also exploratory, not just debates. Yeah.
So one thing, just as an observation here, it's not a suggestion or an idea. I just want to share something that I've observed over the course of participating in these calls over the last, I don't know how many months. The times where we have, so if we're sticking to this idea of what maximizes engagement, I look at the periods where engagement has been highest. I think around when we were first figuring out DAI drift, around maybe February, March. I remember a lot of people being on these calls, a lot of strong opinions, a lot of back and forth. I think more recently with the tokenized asset portfolios discussion, there was a lot of back and forth. It does seem to support Chris's point that some of these more controversial topics, where there are potentially many different ways to, as Long for Wisdom said, like interpret the data and come to very different conclusions, and using this forum to mediate the different ways that we think about these things and arrive at common answers, or at least try to understand each other's perspective. Those things have generated more engagement. The types of things that are very useful that don't often generate as much engagement have been presentations where somebody's presenting a set of things or a set of facts or a set of thoughts, and then can be a little bit forced to say, okay, well, what questions do you guys have? And sometimes there are, but I find those things pretty useful at times, other times not as much, but many times quite useful to get on the same page with the community on, for instance, Nick presented on oracles the other day. Cyrus has presented a number of things on risk. Vishesh has an ongoing presentation. And so those things are very useful, even though they don't seem to generate as much engagement as thinking about the controversial things. So one of the things maybe that's interesting to do is take a step back and say, well, should we be trying to maximize engagement? And is that really one of the primary goals that we have? To what extent do we want to take away from other purposes of these calls in order to achieve this goal of engagement? So that's just a set of observations. It's not any suggestion or anything like that. Like, when have we been more engaged and when have we been less engaged? And is it necessarily a bad thing when people aren't stepping up to engage?
Yeah, that's a good observation. So one of the things that we should probably take into account is that we have a very limited amount of time to discuss issues here. It's largely a push medium where there's presentations and speechifying and some light back and forth, but it's Vishesh's state of the peg and all the rest of it. So maybe it's a question also of an appropriate level of back and forth and debates, and then some kind of sentiment gathering about whether people feel things are working appropriately.
I think sorry, give me just a second. So I think that any time that there's like a debate, the purpose should always be to try to like educate the people that are listening to the debate, right? Like, so trying to just really become clear and articulate about the whatever it is that's being discussed. So like, I think there is utility to debates and also presentations naturally, but yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. What are you gonna say, Matt?
I think on that topic, as someone who didn't start regularly joining the calls until more recently, and I'm definitely guilty of lurking sometimes when I do have questions, is just that oftentimes this information, especially for someone who hasn't been as actively engaged for a long time, it's a lot to take in the presentation format. And while understandably in a group like this, there's hesitation to give homework, so to speak, I think that flipping the format somewhat and putting a little bit more information in, like front-loading the information a little bit more in the forum or otherwise, so that, you know, if there is a meatier topic, people can come in with perhaps more fully formed thoughts and questions, and feel more prepared to engage in the discussion. I don't know how much preparation people would actually do ahead of time, but I would certainly appreciate front-loading things a little bit more so that it can be like, rather than 10 minutes of presentation and then questions, it can kind of be just like, so like, you've all read the thing, like, let's just talk about it. And maybe have that, yeah, like a sort of two sides to kickstart the discussion, and then go from there.
Yeah, I love that, Matt. It raises something that we've been wrestling with for the last few weeks, or well, actually longer, but the last few weeks in earnest, is that MakerDAO and governance is work. It requires time and cycles from people that are engaged in this system. And we're trying to understand what is a reasonable set of expectations from the community? Is it reasonable to expect that the people in this call and the people in the core governance stakeholding demographic are going to spend 2 weeks or 2 hours a week doing their MakerDAO homework so they're sufficiently up to speed on the next vote? Is that a realistic expectation? And if not, what is a realistic expectation? That's one of the things that we've been trying to come up with a strategy on. And that, how do we move from getting enough engagement to actually kickstart governance? We've achieved that, mission accomplished. How do we get people to start getting out there and voting? Mission accomplished. Well, at least I shouldn't. That actually didn't work well for the last person who said mission accomplished. So we're on the road to getting increased engagement. That's great. But one of the struggles that we've been hearing more and more often is that people just don't have the bandwidth to get up to speed on a vote every week. And so what can we do to onboard people that are actually engaged in the system so they understand what these issues are? So does that mean we have governance? The Local Wisdom does governance at a glance, which is an enormously valuable resource, but still that's taken 2 or 3 hours of forum trolling and YouTube video watching and condensed that down to maybe an hour of forum recap reading. Is an hour still too much to ask? I've been pinged in various channels by large holders asking what should they do and how should they vote. And I'm trying to help figure out what that answer is, because we can't tell you what you should do or how you should vote. But we can try to brainstorm on how to get some resources together. And so one of the things we were talking about is, well, all right, so the solution is we need to find some magical, digestible amount of information that we can present on a weekly basis. So here's the 20-minute this week in MakerDAO governance recap that people can look at and get themselves comfortably well informed, and then have them feel like they can engage in the system. But then the question becomes, everything has more layers to it. So the question becomes, how can we provide that in a way that's unbiased? Is it possible for the foundation to provide that in an unbiased manner? If we accept that we can't, who can? And if we do that, are we obligated to sort of incentivize multiple opinions? Which kind of loops back to the thing I talked about earlier, where everybody seems to be generally aligned on what MakerDAO is supposed to do and how we're supposed to get to maintain the stability of the peg and do the next thing and the next thing. But as Alex pointed out, that's not always going to be the case. And in the future, we're going to find parties arising and people seeking to campaign. Sorry, I'm not sure if it was you, Alex, or you, Chris. Somebody recently pointed out in the call that we need to figure out how are we going to start catering to different demographics? How do we get them educated quickly enough? How do we get them into the system in a way that doesn't lower the bar too far, but doesn't raise it too far? So I guess that's kind of where I'm struggling, is where is that bar supposed to be? Because we don't want to have a governance system with a plug-in where you can just like click a button on Twitter and then vote in MakerDAO governance. That would be an absolute disaster in my opinion. But so what level do people, what tooling, what education, what kind of pack can we give people to get them into the system in a way that they can do enough diligence? That's the thing that I'm really struggling with these days.
Yeah, I think
some of that will also come about not only when it's a question of can they do their homework, but also are they feeling somewhat disenfranchised? When we have a yes or no vote on some items, that clearly can be a more just raw democracy of 51%. I think some of the elements happen when you have, a lot of smaller folks that get outweighed by one whale. When we start doing everything with a percentage and the numbers are a spectrum that cross 12 different votes, I guess there's an aspect of proposing the change in doing a weighted model such that even the guy who's got one maker and votes for 0%, that should still have some statistical impact on lowering it. I'm all for doing the weighted model that we have it set up right now, or the exponential model, but the ultimate calculation, from my sense of things, needs to be more of a computed number that we then have an executive vote to push through. But I mean, that would more represent the will of everybody, because I think what we're struggling with is a little bit of the chicken before the egg, of where we have voters that get just somewhat disenfranchised because, there's no reason to really read about it because my vote doesn't matter because 12 people or 15 people or 20 make all the decisions, so why do I even need to learn about it? I think some of the challenge becomes whenever you get everybody to find out that their vote actually does matter, because it did change the ultimate calculation, even if it's by 0.0001%. It had an impact, therefore, please be engaged, because it does matter. It actually does change it. Not like voting for a proxy vote for a corporation where you're voting yes or no for a given board member. This is a direct interest number, an interest rate change. Again, the ones that are yes and no, discount my comment, but the ones that are driven around numerical changes, I think it's important to have as much of an inclusive calculation as possible. And I think that'll help your engagement question about how you can get more people to want to read about it, and therefore they'll participate more.
Yeah, okay, so let's do the debate thing. Let's do the point counterpoint on this one, because there's so many pros and cons here that we get deep into the weeds, and then we had the conversations in the past, and then we get so deep in the weeds, we're like, okay, forget it. Let's just stick with what we got and move on.
Right.
So we're talking about what holographic liquid type democracy, right? Where people, is that what you're referring to, Matthew, or you just want to this.
I mean, those are words I don't really know exactly what that means, but in my mind's eye, if you've got, I mean, I can't do the math fast enough, and some people can in their head, I can't, but if you had 100 maker in favor of 0% and 200 maker in favor of 10%, then the number shouldn't be 10. It needs to be something statistically or mathematically calculated, the weighted computation of those, because otherwise the guys who voted 0 the next time, what's their purpose in voting?
Yeah, this is a really interesting rock to turn over, because we have a governance system and we allow people to vote on things. And the instinctive human reaction, at least from my limited Western cultural perspective, is that as soon as somebody asks you to vote, you're now engaged in a representative democracy. And so we all have the baggage associated with what that means. And then once you get into the system, you find out, or you remember, or see evidence of the fact that that's precisely not what we have here. It's fundamentally, it was designed not to be a representative democracy. It's a skin in the game mechanism that was designed so people with the most to lose would invest the most time and effort into making decisions that would protect their own interests and, by extension, protect the ecosystem. Obviously, we all know that, but just it's helpful to have that out there. Then we have this competing set of incentives, the ones, the mental baggage that I was just discussing, that people come into the system saying, okay, well, here's a system, the Maker protocol. We now have agency and we can make decisions for ourselves, and this is all very crypto anarchy, and this is great. I'm going to vote, and then you rapidly discover that, okay, well, that vote didn't move the needle at all. What's the point of this? Figuring out where the middle ground is between those two things is incredibly complicated, at least from my perspective, because what's the most important thing? Is it to guarantee the security of the system by the people that have the most to lose if that system fails, or is it to have a financial system that most closely hews to the ways that people want that system to look from an ideological perspective? I don't know. Then that's not a rhetorical question. Matthew, what do you think of that?
I mean, I just put it in the chat group. We all have something to lose. Any maker holder has something to lose, right? So yes, the people who are the whales are the most incentivized, and they have the most skin in the game. They have the most, they don't have all, and that's really the point, is that there would be some silly guy who would vote for, or gal who would vote for a 0% interest rate who has one maker. And statistically calculating, then people, that the number that would ultimately blend out to be would be almost a rounding error in terms of the final calculation. But having a maker token, if we're going to go down the whole, what is it to be a token holder? If we're all sharing the same risk, those who own it, then all the people who vote, the vote should actually matter. Now, it may not matter on the yes or no stuff, like are we going to implement MCD or not, or exponential rate stepping, yes or no. But when we talk about calculating the interest rates, people become disenfranchised, myself included, where it really doesn't matter if I vote. And yeah, we can start putting together the whole representative structure where, and there's another word for that and I don't remember it. You guys would know it, but where basically I'm representing other people. That doesn't exist today. Maybe it will exist one day.
The delegation model. I was just about to start talking about that.
Yeah, delegation can work, but to me, that you can also just skip that step. And with my respect, my small little incremental piece that I have, yeah, it might influence the interest rate to go from, instead of 10.5 to 10.499997. We all have the same risk. It's just pro rata risk.
Sure, but so we have these issues. It's important to look at these things from the high level and then start working your way down to the mechanics of it, I think. And so the issue is that engagement is probably always going to stay very low if we have a system where anybody with less than 10,000 maker is not going to feel confident that their opinion matters anyway. So what's the point? If that is an issue that we as a community feel that needs to be absolutely addressed, it has to be inclusive for governance to work effectively. then we have to start looking at different mechanisms to get people involved. And I'm concerned that the mechanisms to get those mechanisms are untested in the wild. So it's obviously something that we'll all be talking about for a while, but I didn't look at, so Loan for Wisdom pointed out that I'm not aware of any civil protection for liquid democracy unless, when we start getting to these complex voting mechanisms, they become more and more reliant on identity. And identity is a loaded thing to talk about. But if I wanted to move the vote, I would just take whatever maker I did have, split it up into 10,000 pieces, and then use it to dilute, right? So it's all of this stuff is super complicated, and pulling apart the philosophy versus the mechanics is extremely complex. The delegation thing, though, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think, at least in my mind, that's the short-term answer, which checks a lot of boxes. That it allows for self-organization from the community, so all the minnows and all the krills can get together and create their own whale in an Aragon DAO or some other mechanism, and then begin exerting their will that way. And it allows
the argument to be intentionally argumentative. Sorry, I'm joking, but what's the purpose of putting a bunch of minnows and fish together to create a whale when you could just be a percentage, small incremental influence against a whale? And that's my point. Rather than trying to have 3 whales vote over whether or not it's 10,500 versus 11,600, to me, it makes more sense that whatever the number is that ultimately computes, which represents the will of the people who own the token holders, who on a collective basis share the collective risk, that calculation is representative of those people who voted. I mean, to me, delegation, it sounds...
Isn't that where it falls apart, though?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that where because if you talk about weighting and this liquid, or I always get them mixed up, whether it's liquid or holographic, or whether those are both the same thing. But if you start adding these sort of bespoke weighting mechanisms to the ecosystem, you're not talking about who has the most at stake or who represents the, I don't know. This is where it gets so murky.
Well, I kind of understand Matthew's point, but he's dividing these two things, right? Raw MKR weight and the risk that carries versus the fact that we are all individuals, and what 10,000 MKR is for that whale, some other dude's 50 MKR or 10 MKR to him is just proportionally the same amount of risk individually, right? So it's like a social argument versus the system's sort of core value from the beginning, that only raw MKR weight matters in terms of voting, because it simplifies everything, right?
Yeah, that's good clarity. Maybe I'm falling into this trap where I've been reading our own docs for too long, and where the only risk in this system is to maker holders being diluted, and there's obviously, that's a very black and white and possibly simplistic view of things. I get it. Right,
but I do think Matthew's point, it's not that it's invalid in any objective way. I just think that it's very, again, it's just exploitable, and if this is something that maker governance wants to pursue, then it has to be what?
Respectfully, how is that exploitable? That people who have a window of voting, no different than what we do now. So what I would be proposing is taking the exact same structure of voting that we have now, not changing anything. But the vote that goes to the executive vote wouldn't be the winning participant, wouldn't be the number that was the 10.5 or 12.5. It would be the 10.4763212589, because that would be the computationally weighted average of the people who actually voted. I don't know how you would exploit it.
All right, no, I see what you're saying. Sorry, I was misunderstanding your idea. Okay, that makes sense.
So my question is then, wouldn't people just vote for the minimum or maximum value, always, to get the most weight out, right?
But it won't be that. Fine, let them. That's great. Let's get inclusiveness. At the end of the day, the whales will still have the largest weighted average that will move the boat.
But this is the thing, the whales will do that as well. Everyone will just vote for the minimum or maximum,
and that is a great digestion process to happen. At the end of the day, we're all going to vote where we think it really matters. I don't think I would vote for 0 if I wanted it to go down. I would just vote where I think it should go. Because, I mean, that's an educational process where it will happen at some point where people vote the wrong way. We get a result we don't like, and we will learn and adjust over time that doing something silly, like trying to move the marker that much, if whales move the marker that much, that is the will of the people who are maker holders. That is the risk of owning it, is that the community does that. In my mind,
Can I just try to circle this back to what we were originally talking about? Because I think it makes for a great segue. Back to the original topic, which was how do we increase engagement on the governance call? And something really struck me, Rich, that you said before, which was that you get outreach from top maker holders asking them how they should vote, right? Or they're asking you how you should vote, which, you know, it raises the question for me, what are we actually trying to accomplish on this call? If we're, you know, I'm assuming the majority of the people on this call are very small maker holders who aren't making much of a dent in the vote. And I don't know, there might be a whale here, I don't know. But let's just assume that most of us are not making any big moves in the vote. What are we actually trying to accomplish on this call? You know, I think that's the biggest kind of outstanding question that I have, you know, and historically from the calls I've been on, it's been pretty one directional. We're just being told, okay, here's what's happening, here's the information, etc. But like, what do we want to get out of this? Do we want to come out of this with firm recommendations for those whales so that, you know, at least as far as the system works now, do we want to come out of these calls and be able to go to those whales and say, look, here's how we think you should vote? You know, or is that just something that's too esoteric and we shouldn't be thinking about?
No, I think that's probably what is happening. And Long for Wisdom and I have had some discussions about this very topic because we have governance is sort of bifurcated slightly. We have the governance portal, and that's where maker token holders vote. Obviously, the more maker you have, the bigger your vote. We have the governance forum, or the MakerDAO forum, where all the debates, all the evidence is presented, and all the consensus is reached. That is a very loose and very non-civil resistant representative democracy. It's that whoever shows up, whoever raises their own voice, makes decisions, sets policy, creates consensus, which is, you know, presumably that's the will of the people. And what we've seen, or at least what I think is happening, is the community in general sets the tone, sets the baselines, the consensus, the initiatives, creates the debate, and all the unspoken assumptions that go along with that. And then that is the world that the maker token holders, the whales, live in. And so they benefit, presumably they benefit from these calls and all these roll-ups and the governance at a glance and all the rest of it, and then use the assumption or the results, the decisions that were arrived at by the community to choose their direction. So from my perspective, sorry, go ahead.
Do we know that to be true? Do we know that the biggest maker holders are consuming this call and are listening to the viewpoint expressed on this call?
Well, this is crypto. We everything is backwards. In the real world, all of the whales would be on Fox and Friends telling everybody else what to do, and all the voters would be anonymous. And in crypto, all the voters are on chain, and what everybody's actually doing and why they're doing it is a mystery. So it's very difficult to answer that question. I don't know. Presumably, because I have not seen the votes go, I haven't seen any examples of votes going absolutely contrary to the will or the general will of the community against sentiment. So my assumption is that either we're all just independently aligned, or more likely that the large voters follow the lead of these core groups, these calls, and the forums.
Yeah, I think that, you know, to answer Chris's earlier question about like what are we really trying to accomplish on these calls, and just even extending that to like the forum, to everything, like what are we doing with these public discussions? I think it's, you know, like I think of it in two different camps, right? Like there's the actual maker voting, and then there's the public awareness of like what the matters that we're voting on are and what the right decision is according to like our community of governance, right? Because we don't know how much each of us hold in MKR. All we have are our ideas, and all we have are our arguments for what we think is the right thing to do in any given matter. So like, you know, for me, engagement in voting doesn't really, like, I don't really mind that whales are doing the voting, but if there's a really obvious point where, you know, a whale votes contrary to what clearly the entire community is saying is the right decision, then at that point you have a campaign that you can make, right? At that point, it's like, okay, here's the points of reference in the conversations. Here's why this is the right decision. It's all public, it's all documented. It doesn't matter who said it. You know, this is scientific governance. Like, this is like, we don't understand why this 20,000 MKR whale is doing this. It seems very contrary, right? And then you already have a point to make some sort of, some sort of campaign to actually get those whales to change their votes. So I think it's awareness that we're really going for, right? And education, purely.
I'm arguing for and in favor of taking your exact point, David. Like, fast forward the video, what I'm trying to avoid in 2 years, 6 years, 10 years is a contentious hard fork that happens whenever a whale does exactly with what you just said. But because we don't have some type of weighted model where, yeah, some guys got 20,000 and the rest of everybody says the number should be lower, and we get to 19,500, and sorry. And where do we get to? At some point, if we don't introduce a way that represents the will of the people who own it, the larger quantity of people will start to get disenfranchised and will create potentially something that's not an outcome any of us want. So, I mean, at the same time, I know what you're saying. I also just...
I hear the risk you're talking about, though, for sure.
Yeah, it's not unimaginable, and it should be avoided where possible. And one way to avoid it is to know that my small or your small, anybody's small incremental token holder, on a yes or no, it's pure democracy. That's just the way it is. That's fine. But when you start dealing with multiple choice answers, especially when the outcome is an interest rate, I think it's the most simplest implementation to get additional engagement with the smallest downside.
But see, like, that's like a very specific one vote like example, right? Like, and it would make a little bit of a difference, right? Instead of having sort of a vocal impact as a small MKR holder, you have like an actual tangible, like measurable impact on the interest rate, right? Because your vote on 0% rather than 14% moved it 0.005% lower compared to the 20,000 MKR vote that actually decided what the actual interest rate is. I still think you'll be disenfranchised even with a model like that, just like shooting from the hip thinking. But I think like the main thing that we're trying to get at is how do we align MKR holders when we don't know who they are, they're pseudonymous, with this community of people, which are the people on this call, which are the people on the forum. Like, how do we align those two in a way that prevents a contentious sort of fork that you're describing, right, Matthew? Like, that's the whole challenge.
Well, I love the fact that we're talking about this. And starting off this call, I complained that, well, I didn't complain. I put out the question that we don't have enough engagement. And look at all the engagement we got. So that was genius. We have so much engagement that we're about to squeeze out the risk segment, because we still have to hear from Vishesh. So if there's any final
just
thoughts.
one thing, let me just jump in on one more thing, because I think Matthew makes really, really great points. And I think that just based on what I'm hearing here, if the system is working the way it's supposed to, and the large maker holders are using the forum, are using this call, are using the chat, are using any of these resources to help them determine how to vote, then Matthew, myself, Rich, everybody on this call who's a small maker holder, all of a sudden has a huge, huge impact on the outcome of the vote, right? So, and to Long for Wisdom's point before, you know, if scientific governance is working the way it's supposed to, and we are coming to rational, logical, scientific decisions where there really is no other realistic outcome, and we're being able to communicate that, all of a sudden, each one of us, if we hold one maker or 100 maker tokens, or 1,000, you know, whatever, we're all of a sudden all having an impact. So in the current system, I wouldn't underestimate your impact, especially you, Matthew. I mean, you are a huge resource for me in learning about things on these calls, on Twitter, in the forums. And if you have 2 MKR, all of a sudden it's probably worth 2,000 or 20,000 because of the impact that you're having just through those interactions. So I would not underestimate that in looking at the sway that each of us has. And what I would like to find out as a next step here is, if there are large MKR holders that are like listening to this call right now, like give us a sign. We would like to know if we are having some impact, right? It's like, we want to know if the governance calls are working, if you're getting valuable information from them, if debates would be helpful, because that's what basically these calls are designed to help move those organizations' votes, if I'm reading everything correctly.
Right.
So,
I mean, I remember seeing this idea of like what is it, like a Telegram group where you have to basically prove that you're the owner of a certain address in order to like have like speaking rights or something. I don't know if it was a Telegram group or like Discord or something, but like somebody was thinking about writing a bot like that, and I thought it would be really cool to have like a sort of pseudonymous chat room where like you just know that these are like the whoever MKR holders. I don't know. But the communication between actual MKR holders and the general community would be a great thing.
Yeah, I like the idea, Chris. We should try not to lose that. Figuring out if we can build a bridge between the anonymous whales and the pseudo-anonymous krills like us. Look, we have to move on. Matthew, thank you for raising all those issues. What I want to leave the group with, though, and here's it's going to sound like a cop-out, but it's not. Governance is evolving rapidly, and the governance we have today is not going to be the governance we have in 6 months. So these issues are going to become crystal clear over time. If I had to predict over the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to be addressing representation a lot more than we have been in the past, and then things are going to begin to develop. People will begin to campaign. People will begin to form parties. Delegation is going to happen, whether we like it or not. People are moving in these directions, and so we'll be addressing these things more and more. Matthew, so let's put this on hold for now, though. Thanks everybody for this super spicy discussion. It was very valuable to me. Long for Wisdom, you were complaining earlier observing earlier that there isn't much to talk about in governance at a glance stuff. Is there any thread that you wanted to talk about, or could we pass it over to Vishesh?
The only one thing I'd mention is the debt ceiling poll is still up. So if you have strong feelings about that, go vote. Otherwise, yeah, it's been pretty quiet. So.
Yeah, hit up that thread actually, and then we can tell the whales what to do. And exercise our representative democracies if the system is working that way. All right, Vishesh, we're going to let you kick it off. Oh yeah, any bets on the battery level today before he shares his screen?
I vote 6%. 6%.
Yeah, I don't know. He might troll us though. He's that kind of guy. I think 100. I think he's going to come in bold with 100%. 90.
Wow. Oh, dude. Well, at least you were closer than my guess. So.
Vishesh, if you're talking to us, we can't hear you. Are you muted? Maybe you should check your sound settings, Vishesh.
We also don't hear you generally, even when you're not sharing your screen.
Uh-oh, uncomfortable silence. I'm not gonna make it. I'm not gonna make it.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah,
there you go.
Cool. Let me just reopen everything I just closed.
Vishesh, did you intentionally charge your battery because of last week's conversation, or is it just coincidence?
Are you bowing to peer pressure? What's going on? Tell us about your battery.
I think he got shamed into charging it from the thumbnail of the last governance and risk meeting.
Oh, I mean, you got to work harder than that. I mainly just wanted to switch things up. I'm sure some people were taking bets on my battery life at this point, so I just wanted to switch it up.
I saw an auger market.
Yeah,
Let's see,
Just joking.
did Vishesh fix the market? What's your cut, Vishesh? This is a racket.
let's not have any of that kind of talk. All right, so just to bring it back, overall, it's been a little bit quiet in terms of the metrics in the past week or so, despite the fact that the stability fee was lowered. So that's something interesting that I think people are going to want to talk about in the spirit of some of the earlier discussion around sharing some of these things up front so that people can have time to think and talk about them. I mean, a big portion of this is going to be, we have a sense of what the state of things looks like right now, but it's getting more and more precarious. So it'll be curious to see how people want to preempt some conversational topics that will come up. So I'll explain that extremely vague comment in a moment. So what's been going on with supply? DAI supply, as we know, took a bit of a hit with the jump in ETH price a little over a week ago. Since then, it's just been slowly and steadily climbing up a little bit. So basically, it's come up, I would say, 1 to 2 million since then, through a little bit more drawing than wiping. What's really interesting, though, I'll just jump ahead to, is despite the fact that the borrow rate is actually more expensive on Compound right now than it is on Maker. So don't know who is not refinancing just yet, but that's particularly interesting. So curious to see what the InstaDApp latency period is going to be for that to get refinanced over further to Maker. Or if those users legitimately just have a preference for maintaining those positions on Compound. So that'll be interesting to watch. But yeah, going back to DAI, so collateral-wise, pretty quiet. No huge changes in collateral since the last major period of topping up. Like I said, a little over a week ago, roughly 9-10 days. But yeah, very, very little collateral activity as well in the last week. Obviously, no bites recently because that ETH price has just been more or less stable, coming up slightly, and those users did add a bit more collateral, like I said, slightly over a week ago. So yeah, I mean, all in all, that's pretty quiet. Long-term trends are still kind of holding. The supply, as mentioned, did a little bit of a loop-de-loop. And appears to be slightly recovering, but again, we just have to continue to watch that pace. I mean, it's probably on pace to come up to around 82, maybe 83 million tops without anything significantly changing. But what's interesting is if that ETH price does start to look more attractive to folks, stability fee is low, DAI has been trading, above $1, so it's likely that you could see some re-leveraging behavior and see that supply come up again fairly significantly if people are, seeing ETH sort of slowly and steadily grow in price, or whatever it is that happens to ETH price that makes it more attractive for them to seek that leverage, which again we can only really guess at. And then yeah, so some of these long-term relationships between collateral and ETH price still holding steady. This appears to be one of the most reliable rules when it comes to Maker, is just how people respond to risk. And then as far as the DAI supply and the ETH price, again, that relationship is a little bit tough to predict sometimes. But basically when ETH is low, they kind of tend to track more proportionally than inversely. And when ETH is sort of crashing, then or spiking up, then that trend tends to reverse itself, which makes sense, and that's something that we can unpack a little bit if people have questions. But yeah, so as far as the DAI price, in the last 24 hours, pretty low volume. but the price has been steadily above $1. Most of that volume has been Oasis and a bit Uniswap as well. I think so here's a 7-day, so basically similar. Most of the volume on Oasis, a decent portion on Uniswap, and Radar Relay and Coinbase are getting a decent amount of volume. But for a 7-day period, I mean, 17, 18 million is pretty solid, or slightly above normal. I think the average lately has been around 2 million a day. So basically anything that's higher than that is a fairly active day. Though I would say maybe 2-3 months ago, you would see a little bit higher daily trading volume than that.
So Vishesh, can I jump in for a second and
yeah.
ask you a question?
Sure.
In regards to volume amounts, like how big are DAI markets compared to other things? Like I'm trying to get a sense of like whether 2 million a day on DAI markets.
Small is the answer.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So small is the answer. I mean, DAI has generally had pretty small trading volume, and I think some people have done some analysis on this as well. Kind of thin liquidity, and that's always been like something to watch with regards to DAI. I think those order books, it's a problem someone should think about at some point, tend to have fairly light liquidity, which makes DAI susceptible to sort of price crunches. Generally, I think lately has worked in DAI's favor in that the price has generally been pushed up through that lack of liquidity more so than down. But in the event of stuff like what we saw in, I think it was February, where that price is actually getting pushed down because you have a sudden flood of DAI being sold on the market, then that's something to watch. So just to touch on some of the lending metrics here. So essentially, this is what I was talking about earlier, where that borrow rate is still slightly above the stability fee. So this is just an opportunity for refinancings to occur. It's interesting to consider this borrow rate is back down to 10.5%, which in the total life cycle of DAI has been a pretty low, mid to low rate. So we can look back at some of the, this will load in a sec, at some of the older metrics, we can see that when DAI was, when the stability fee was around 16, 17%, we saw, it's going to take forever to load, we saw a fairly heavy amount of activity. So it's interesting that the stability fee is lower now than it was then by a pretty wide margin, but we're still seeing somewhat subdued levels of activity. So that just, I think, generally has to do with the fact that people have, I think, in recent past been a little bit weary about leveraging behavior, probably because a lot of those traders got burned through some of the ETH price crashes. But I'm sure they're out there somewhere, and I'm sure there will be a certain confluence of market events that will make leverage attractive to them again. And that will, I think, be an interesting moment to watch as far as what happens to the DAI supply, around some of the conversations about debt ceiling, around some of the conversations around the asymmetry of DAI and how comfortable the community is lowering that stability fee further and further and further in the absence of a huge amount of demand, because when that demand comes flooding back, or if that demand comes flooding back, it could depress the DAI price pretty significantly. And so that's where I say that DAI is in a somewhat precarious position at the moment. And it will be interesting to see how comfortable, how low the community is comfortable going. So as far as the supply rates, I mean, that has actually tracked pretty well with the stability fee. I think people are pretty quick to supply more DAI, to buy up and supply more DAI as those rates become more attractive compared to the stability fee. So that actually maintains a pretty efficient buffer to the stability fee. So as far as the volumes, it kind of explains why those rates go the way they do. So essentially the borrow volumes for compounded DYDX have held pretty steady and just come up slightly with the drop in the stability fee, but really not much change. So generally what you would have expected, as you can see here, when it was dropped from 18, 16, 14, 12, those borrow volumes came up a bit. Now, they did drop again because of that ETH price crash, but you would have expected, I think, a little bit more of a rise in volume with the 10.5% change. That may yet still happen. So it's pretty early into that change to be able to make any significant conclusions. And that's the biggest thing I think I would stress for people, is to just take a beat before making any significant conclusions about what's going on, because it's still a very low latency since the change. So supply volumes, again, they were pretty steady, had come up a bit, dipped down, and now kind of recovered slightly. So those supply volumes, I think, are fairly responsive to changes like this. So it was roughly 33 for compound and 12 for DYDX. Post the change, came up to roughly 35 and 11. So DYDX actually dipped slightly, compound rose up a little bit. So more or less evened out. And so not a huge change in supply over the last month. As far as the excess supply, again, so we saw that jump in the amount of excess supply, aka dip in utilization around that ETH price crash, just leading up to it. And so that has come down a little bit lately, but the drop in the stability fee, I think, is liable to push down the utilization a little bit on the compound. And so that's what you see here is DYDX, again, generally a fairly unpredictable utilization rate, but has come up a little bit lately, whereas compound had come down pretty significantly leading up to that ETH price crash, recovered a little bit, and will now start to slightly dip. Yeah, so I don't know why this page is taking forever to load, but this just, this graph will show a little bit of just long-term what we're talking about. So over the last couple months, DAI price has pretty consistently stayed a buffer slightly above $1. There were moments where that liquidity was stressed a little bit and the price shot down very briefly, but more or less it has been sitting slightly above $1, despite the stability fee decreases, which generally says that even though the rates were made cheaper, it is primarily a function of that demand. And so that demand has been a little bit lighter lately, I think, which has caused a little bit less leveraging behavior, which has caused a little bit less selling DAI on the market versus buying it as a bit of a risk hedge to sort of diversify risk profiles and to collect a little bit of a passive yield. As far as network activity, so one of the interesting things, transaction volume. We saw some spikes in transaction volume, end of 2018, and then it was very light at the beginning of 2019, had started to come up during the summer with some solid peaks around July. So what's interesting is that in the mid-August timeframe, it had come down a little bit. We saw some spikes, which we tend to see when ETH price makes significant movements in either direction. So with the most recent ETH price crash, we did see a bit of a jump in transaction volume.
Is that
in terms of the
is
number,
that because of DEX trading?
So it's partly because of DEX trading, but DEX trading actually doesn't account for a huge chunk of the total transaction volume. So I think part of it is contracts, right? So there are a lot of smart contracts that, InstaDApp, through Compound, DYDX, et cetera, that move some DAI around when there are significant changes in rates. And those significant changes in rates tend to follow those significant price changes. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people trading DAI, like buying and selling it when there are significant ETH price movements, but there are other ways in which large quantities of DAI move around when there are large ETH price movements, just as more of an indirect effect. As far as the number of transactions, so you can sort of see here, the total number of transactions has been sort of consistently growing. And this is interesting to compare to the transaction volume. So though those amounts may have been a little bit more unpredictable lately, the total number of transactions has grown. Though I would attribute a large portion of that due to buzz and also due to a growing ecosystem of smart contracts that move DAI around. And so you clearly saw that sort of peaking around late July, early August, coming down a little bit, but maintaining a pretty solid sort of baseline lately. Okay, so that's what I had to show today, but happy to answer any questions if people have.
I have a question that you cannot answer. I'll ask it anyways. What happens, so that you mentioned something about contracts responding to market pressures or to the stability fees, which immediately terrified me, because one of the reasons why MakerDAO hasn't moved to sort of algorithmic responses to market shifts is because it's gameable and it's difficult to predict how the system might spiral out of control based on somebody else's input. Do you think that this represents a potential risk for the future if we have InstaDApp and Compound and XYZ and 5 other apps with significant amounts of collateral behind them responding sort of autonomously to each other's activities? Like, doesn't that kind of set us up for some unusual spiraling effects? Or am I? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's more of a commentary than anything else. So, like,
yeah, are you sort of concerned about like completeness and circular behavior, or?
Yeah, I'm concerned about InstaDApp causing an avalanche from Compound into Maker, from Maker back into Compound, responding negatively to that kind of reaction, and then having this thing spiral in ways that people
I mean, I generally think that things like InstaDApp are efficiency layers and are usually just speeding up some sort of rate arbitrage. So I don't, like, in terms of filtering that out to get real better approximations of like transaction volume is something to consider. But as far as being concerned that those are somehow having a negative economic effect on the function of Maker and DAI, I mean, I don't really see the case, but I'm open to people's thoughts. My sense would be that that would simply be an economic efficiency layer that's being applied to the existing DAI ecosystem so that those rates can be arbitraged more quickly and more efficiently. Yeah, I mean, Patrick has a point here. It's sometimes more concerning to consider those inefficiencies persisting in what rates are being offered and those not being arbitraged quickly.
Yeah, effective arbitrage is critical to the health of the ecosystem. I agree completely. It's I'm concerned with runaway bots, the runaway bot problem, when we've seen that in the past where DAI would get listed on an exchange and whoever's running the bots there was unaware that DAI is intended to be a stable coin, and so we see these very unusual behaviors. And I'm wondering what would happen if we move that to a macro perspective where we have these small protocols attempting to maximize for their own user bases based on activity in other protocols, and having some kind of runaway situation where it doesn't end well for anybody. But I guess, like I said, it's completely rhetorical. It's going to happen, I guess. What it looks like if it does is going to be an interesting thing to watch. All right, I'm going to start the awkward silence countdown clock. If anybody has any more questions for Vishesh or anything else in general, please ask them now. We are 7 minutes past the hour, though, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for their contributions. Vishesh, that was great. Thank you to Chris for your awesome suggestions as well. And Matthew, as always, our friendly neighborhood contrarian, here to remind us that we need to improve in the future. It's always a great reminder to have. If anyone has any other questions that might bubble up to the surface after the call is over, please join us in the forums, because The forums are where governance happens. Seems slightly redundant, but I'll post a link. You can guess it, forum.makerdao.com. Hit us up there. We'll have a summary of this call will be appearing soonish. And if there's any other questions or topics you want to address, please add them to that thread and or dig into the rest of the forum, because there's a lot of really interesting things happening. Okay. All right, I talked myself through that potentially awkward silence. There's no additional questions, so let's call it there. All right, thanks everybody. Talk to you next week, possibly. See how DevCon goes. All right, bye.